Hey everyone, tonight we're kicking things off with something really weird. The medieval way of thinking that's still kind of running the show in our lives. So before you get too comfy, take a sec to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you actually dig what I'm doing here. And drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see who's joining us from all over the globe. Okay, now let's dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that nice, soft background noise. And let's dive into tonight's kinda crazy journey together. You probably think that whole 9 to 5 workday thing came about during the Industrial Revolution, dreamed up by some clever Victorian dudes in vests figuring out the perfect number of working hours before employees started kicking the bucket. But nope, it actually came from monks. Back in the Middle Ages, monks were pretty much the only people organized enough to keep track of time, and annoying enough to make everyone else do the same. Their lives were dictated by this never-ending cycle of bells. Bells in the morning, bells at noon, bells for praying, bells for eating, bells for regretting that you ever became a monk. It was less about spiritual growth and more like a divine alarm system with extra guilt thrown in. The day was broken down into what they called canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, which sound more like spells that didn't make the cut for Harry Potter. At set times, monks would stop whatever they were doing to chant, kneel, or just zone out into eternity. It wasn't about getting things done efficiently. It was about obeying the rules. You weren't supposed to think too much. You were supposed to get in sync with God, the abbey, and whoever was in charge of ringing the bell. And, of course, there was always that one monk who'd ring it 2 minutes early just to watch the chaos unfold. Peasants eventually caught on, using whatever scraps they could find to divide their homes. Hanging a blanket between you and the pigsty suddenly felt luxurious. Curtains became the medieval version of noise-canceling headphones, mostly symbolic, but slightly effective. Over time, the idea spread. Privacy became something to strive for. By the Renaissance, curtains were everywhere. On beds, walls, windows, and egos. The wealthier you were, the thicker your curtains. And centuries later, we still do it. We draw our curtains at night as if we're hiding from the Inquisition, not just the neighbor's porch light. We buy blackout curtains, thermal curtains, and privacy shears. Proof that we've upgraded the fabric, but not the paranoia. So, the next time you close your curtains before bed, remember you're reenacting a medieval ritual to protect yourself from judgment, gossip, and cold air. The only real difference is that your neighbors probably aren't watching. Probably. When you hear "God Save the King," you probably think of national pride, a dignified anthem sung by loyal citizens. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't about patriotism at all. It was an exorcism. The phrase started out as a protective prayer, a kind of spiritual insurance policy for monarchs who had the life expectancy of a ham sandwich at a jousting tournament. Medieval people truly believed kings were chosen by God, but also that Satan had terrible boundaries. Every rebellion, plague, or bad harvest was blamed on demonic interference. So, God Save the King wasn't a cheer. It was crisis management. Whenever a ruler got sick, or someone sneezed near the throne, the church organized public prayers to keep evil away. Entire crowds would chant "God Save the King," like it was a magic spell, because in their minds, it was. The thinking went something like this. If enough peasants yelled the phrase loud enough, God might hear them over the screams of the dying. It worked about as well as you'd expect. Then came Tullia di Aragona, poet, philosopher, and rumored lover of half the Vatican secretaries. Tullia wrote essays defending women's right to pleasure, something that made priests choke on their communion wafers. Her home became a gathering place for artists and thinkers, where discussions about theology somehow always circled back to the topic of lust. These women navigated the dangerous game of Roman society like seasoned diplomats. In a city ruled by men who preached purity but practiced indulgence, courtesans became the most cunning players. They knew every secret, every affair, and every whispered promise made in candlelit confessionals. A well-placed word from a courtesan could ruin a career or ignite a papal feud. And they weren't just tolerated, they were necessary. When diplomacy failed, Rome sent not soldiers but smiles. Noble women lived under surveillance, but courtesans moved freely. their charms serving as unofficial ambassadors. Behind their painted lips and jeweled corsets, they held the true intelligence network of the Renaissance. Ironically, these sinners often showed more wit and dignity than their supposed moral superiors. They played the system that oppressed them and turned it into an art. While priests chased them in secret and poets immortalized them in verse, the courtesans of Rome proved that power didn't always wear a mitre. Sometimes, it wore a veil of silk. While priests and popes made headlines with their excesses, noble women of Renaissance Rome cultivated their own brand of scandal, one far more discreet, but no less daring. These women lived in marble palaces gilded with virtue, yet their hearts and letters burned with passion. Marriage in their world was a political contract, not a romantic union. So, when a duchess found herself chained to a dull husband twice her age, the natural solution was a confessor, one who listened very carefully and, on occasion, stayed the night. The horses were both your partners and your potential executioners. You committed to memory every snort, twitch, and tremor. For horses, one mind. That was the ultimate goal. If one faltered, the others would follow. If one panicked, all were doomed. You learned to whisper to them, to curse them, to pray with them. Their eyes, wide with fire and fear, reflected your own. You didn't control them. You became them. Trainers hurled insults, cracked whips, and showered you with abuse whenever you failed. One old veteran, half deaf and half mad, told you that a true charioteer never blinked during a crash. You'll see splinters fly, blood spray, skulls crack, he rasped. But if you blink, boy, you'll miss your chance to live. He wasn't wrong. To simulate the chaos of the circus, they unleashed you into mock races filled with dust, shouts, and mayhem. Rivals slammed into your chariot wheels, attempting to shatter them. You learned to wield your whip not just on the horses, but on the other drivers, striking at their arms or faces. There were no rules in training because there were none in the arena. Survival was the only lesson that mattered. By dusk, your muscles screamed, your hands bled, and your heart pounded like a war drum. But the pain dulled, and something colder took its place. A strange sense of calm. You realized that fear was pointless. The sand didn't discriminate between the living and the dead. It only remembered those who had left their mark. That night, you drifted off to sleep among the horses, your fingers still clenched around an imaginary rein. You dreamed of thunder, hooves, wheels, and a crowd chanting a name you swore would soon be yours. The first time you entered the Circus Maximus, you forgot to breathe. You trembled. The sheer noise could overwhelm a man. 200,000 Romans roared like a storm, their cheers reverberating off the stone seats in waves. The first canal builders were visionaries with shovels. Using only simple tools, wooden plows, baskets, and copper adzes, they redirected the river's flow, carving channels through the desert like veins through a body. These canals turned the unpredictable flood into a predictable harvest, guiding water to fields miles from the main riverbanks. With every project, Egypt became less at the mercy of the Nile's moods and more the master of its rhythm. By the Old Kingdom, irrigation had become a state enterprise. Thousands of laborers worked under the watch of engineers and scribes, each basin measured and recorded. Canals weren't just practical, they were political. When a pharaoh ordered a new network of waterways, it wasn't only to feed his people. It was to prove his divine authority. The god-king didn't simply pray for floods. He commanded them. One of the earliest great works was said to be the Bar Yusuf, the Canal of Joseph. Whether myth or memory, it carried water from the Nile to the Fayum Depression, turning a barren basin into Egypt's oldest reclaimed farmland. Centuries later, it would still feed villages, a living monument to ancient hydrology. Even desert towns were bound by the flow. Irrigation transformed their economies and their loyalties. A canal that ran dry could ruin a province, while a well-timed diversion could spark a new settlement. Water became currency, and the pharaoh was its banker. Scribes documented every drop, carving tallies onto papyrus and temple walls. But canals also united Egypt. They became highways for trade, ferrying goods, ideas, and people between distant regions. The same water that grew wheat in the south carried granite for pyramids in the north. The Nile's veins stitched the nation together. Each channel was a statement of intent. Man cooperating with nature, not conquering it. Egypt's greatness didn't rise from conquest or gold. Over the centuries, the rest of the world started catching on. Towns started scheduling their markets according to the church bells. Guilds used them to mark work hours. And eventually, factories just straight up copied the whole system, minus the praying plus screaming managers. When the Industrial Revolution came along, someone basically said, let's take that monk routine, ditch the faith part, and add a bunch of paperwork. And that's how the modern workday was born. At least the monks got peace and quiet, wine, and a robe that doubled as pajamas. You get fluorescent lights and constant Slack notifications. Even your lunch break has roots in those monastic timekeeping practices. The sexth hour, when monks would take a break to pray and maybe sneak in a snack before getting back to their divine spreadsheets. So, the next time your alarm blares at 7 a.m. and you drag yourself to another day of working in exchange for rent and a slightly aching back, just remember, you're not modern. You're medieval, just without the chanting or the possibility of forgiveness. The 9-to-5 workday didn't really evolve. It escaped from the monastery, put on a suit, and learned to say, let's circle back on that. If you've ever sneezed in public and someone muttered, bless you, well, congratulations. You've just taken part in one of humanity's oldest and most ridiculous knee-jerk reactions. It's not about being polite. It's a medieval panic response that never got the memo about germ theory. Back in the 6th century, when the plague was making its rounds through Europe, sneezing wasn't just a minor annoyance. It was a really bad sign. If you sneezed once, people figured you were infected. If you sneezed twice, they started dividing up your stuff. The thinking was pretty simple. When you sneezed, your soul was trying to make a break for it through your nose. And the devil, who was always hanging around, might just swoop in and snatch it up mid-sneeze. Medieval kings still died, mostly from poisoning, warfare, or other kings. But people kept chanting, because superstition is the one political tradition that humanity never reforms. By the 16th century, the phrase had become ceremonial. It showed up in church services, royal processions, and desperate attempts to look loyal. Saying it out loud proved you weren't plotting treason. Or at least not today. In a time when bad-mouthing the crown could get you killed, God Save the King was less about faith and more about self-preservation. The song version came much later, during the 18th century, when England turned this medieval emergency chant into a national anthem. What started as "Please don't let the devil kill our monarch" became "Please don't let France do it instead." And here we are centuries later, still singing it with our hands on our hearts, pretending it's about unity, when historically it was just crowdsourced holy water. So, the next time you hear a stadium full of people belting out, "God Save the King," remember you're witnessing a medieval ghost ritual. Only now it's televised. The idea of a day of rest sounds humane, maybe even progressive, but the medieval. The church didn't come up with Sunday to protect your work-life balance. They invented it to make sure you showed up for Mass. Back in early medieval Europe, the church basically controlled everything, your calendar, your conscience, and, if necessary, your afterlife. So they declared Sunday a sacred day of rest. It wasn't because the peasants needed a break. It was because the priests needed a crowd to preach to. If you got caught working on a Sunday, you weren't just breaking some labor law, you were offending God himself. This wasn't a minor HR thing. It was a one-way ticket to eternal damnation. Imagine having to explain that in confession. "Forgive me, Father, for I weeded my garden during Vespers." Among the whispered legends was Vittoria Colonna, celebrated poet and widow of a nobleman who died on the battlefield. Her piety made her a darling of Rome's religious circles. Yet her friendship with Michelangelo raised eyebrows that never truly lowered. Their correspondence, filled with spiritual longing and poetic tenderness, walked the razor's edge between divine love and forbidden desire. The church called it Platonic, Rome called it obvious. Others were far less subtle. The Orsini and Farnese women, names that carried weight equal to the popes, used their beauty and influence to entangle cardinals, artists, and ambassadors alike. Their salons became theaters of flirtation, where poetry, music, and philosophy were simply pretexts for seduction. Affairs were conducted with coded letters, saintly portraits that concealed miniature love notes, and the occasional pilgrimage that conveniently led to a lover's villa outside the city walls. But discretion was key to survival. If a nobleman's indiscretion could be excused as a vigorous temperament, a woman's could be punished with exile or worse. That didn't stop them. Many noble women mastered the art of looking holy while living wickedly. They went to confession daily, ensuring their sins never piled up too high, and dressed modestly in public while hiding embroidered bodices beneath their cloaks. Behind every painted virgin on a palace wall, there was a story of guilt and hunger. And while the Vatican thundered about purity, Rome's noble women wrote sonnets about passion. They knew the game. Sin quietly, repent beautifully, and never get caught. In a city where men wielded power in public, women learned to wield it in private. And often, their whispers in the dark echoed louder than any sermon from the pulpit. Art was Rome's most respectable disguise for desire. Beneath the halo of divine inspiration, painters and sculptors filled chapels with visions that were less about heaven and more about flesh. Trumpets blared, banners fluttered, and the air was thick with the scent of sweat, dust, and roasting meat. It wasn't just a race. It was a spectacle of passion. The gods of Rome were watching, and so was every gambler, thief, senator, and slave in the empire. You took your place in the starting gates, the carceres, where 8 chariots lined up like loaded arrows. The horses were wild, nostrils flared, hoofs pawing at the sand. You whispered their names like a prayer: Aquila, Nero, Pallas, and Flame, and tightened the reins around your waist. Across the track, the opposing factions glared at you. The Greens were favored that day, and the Blues, your team, were desperate for a victory. The gamblers had already decided who should live and who should die. You just had to prove them wrong. The official dropped his cloth. A heartbeat of silence, and then chaos erupted. The gates burst open, and 8 chariots surged forward like unleashed gods. Sand flew, wheels screamed, and you leaned into the turn. Your entire existence was balanced on 2 spinning wooden circles. The first corner was a battlefield. Drivers whipped their rivals, horses shrieked, and the crowd howled for blood. You felt the jarring impact as a rival slammed into your wheel, trying to destroy it. You braced yourself, guiding your team tighter around the spina, the central barrier adorned with statues of Neptune and dolphins. You brushed past them so closely that salt water from the fountain splashed on your arm. 1 lap down, 6 to go. The crowd's roar transformed into a rhythm, each cheer a drumbeat in your chest. You could feel their eyes on you, thousands of strangers whose love or hatred hinged on a single turn. For a fleeting moment, you understood why men risked everything for this madness. Death no longer frightened you, it exhilarated you. When you crossed the finish line, you didn't know whether you had won or simply survived. It flowed quietly in irrigation trenches, where sweat and engineering transformed survival into civilization. Behind every monument, every harvest, and every floodgate stood a quiet army of minds. The engineers, surveyors, and scribes who turned water into order. They weren't poets or warriors, but Egypt owed them everything. Without them, the Nile's blessings would have drowned or starved the land. With them, it became the most productive river valley on earth. The shaduf, a simple counterweight lever, was one of their earliest triumphs. With it, a single farmer could lift buckets of water from canal to field, feeding crops by hand when the floodwaters had retreated. Later, the sakia, a water wheel powered by oxen, multiplied that effort. What began as manual toil evolved into mechanical rhythm. Egypt's first machines, born from necessity, not luxury. But the real geniuses were the surveyors, known as the rope stretchers. After every flood, when boundaries vanished beneath the silt, they paced the fields with knotted cords, measuring anew. Their work wasn't guesswork. It was geometry. Angles, distances, and proportions were the tools of empire. The knowledge they gathered shaped both the fields and the foundations of temples and tombs. From water levels came symmetry, and from symmetry, civilization. Then came the scribes, the record keepers of the flood. They tracked water heights with nilometers. Stone pillars marked with carved cubits stationed at temples like Elephantine and Philae. These sacred gauges transformed a natural event into data. When the water rose higher than expected, they warned the farmers. When it fell too low, they prepared for famine. The priests interpreted the numbers as divine messages, but the engineers knew they were simply reading the river's pulse. Even the pharaohs relied on these calculations. A misjudged flood meant not just hunger, but revolt. The engineers were, in a sense, guardians of stability. So, Pope Gregory the Great stepped in back in 590 CE and decided that every sneeze needed divine intervention. He told everyone to respond with, "God bless you," basically turning a respiratory function into a team effort. Every "bless you" was like an emergency prayer, a mini exorcism for people with allergies. The phrase spread like wildfire, faster than the plague itself. Soon, every village in Europe was blessing each other into a state of exhaustion. Nobody could even sneeze in peace. Just imagine the sound of it all. Church bells, roosters, and 40 villagers shouting, "God bless you," every time someone inhaled some pollen. And it actually worked, not in a medical sense, but socially. Saying "bless you" became a way of showing you weren't the kind of monster who'd let your neighbor die without a blessing. Not saying it was practically witchcraft. The superstition just stuck around. Even after centuries of science, hygiene, and vaccines, we still bless people when they sneeze like it's still 1348. Nobody really believes their soul is escaping anymore. But we still get a little freaked out by the sound of a nasal explosion. Meanwhile, the only thing that's actually escaping during a sneeze is about 100,000 droplets of bacteria traveling at 100 miles per hour right into your face. And nobody's blessing you for that. So, the next time someone sneezes and you automatically mumble, "Bless you," just remember you're reenacting a medieval ritual that was created to keep Satan out of someone's sinuses. You're not really being polite. You're taking part in a 1,000-year-old shared delusion. And somehow it's still considered good manners. The next time you twirl spaghetti or carefully stab a piece of chicken with your fork, just remember that in medieval Europe, that simple act would have gotten you labeled a heretic. Yep, the fork, that harmless little utensil in your cutlery drawer, was once considered a tool of the devil. The rule was pretty clear. No plowing, no weaving, no blacksmithing, and definitely no selling stuff. Unless, of course, the church wanted to sell indulgences. That was perfectly fine, miraculously so. Sermons warned that anyone who ignored the Lord's Day risked divine punishment. And because medieval Europe loved a good horror story, there were plenty. One legend told of a guy who tried baking bread on a Sunday, and the dough turned into snakes. Another farmer sharpened his scythe and then promptly dropped dead. The moral was clear. God had opinions on your weekend hobbies. Naturally, enforcement was all over the place. Lords and nobles still worked whenever they felt like it because divine law, much like modern policy, didn't really apply to management. The peasants, on the other hand, were threatened with hell for trying to make a living. When the industrial age rolled around, people rediscovered the Sunday rule and rebranded it as family time. Employers called it moral, while workers called it barely enough. And despite 1,000 years of progress, the logic was still medieval. You rest not because you deserve it, but because someone holier, richer, or louder said so. Today, most of us spend Sundays resting by doing unpaid labor, like laundry and running errands and worrying about Monday. It's not exactly holy, but it's definitely traditional. So, the next time you feel guilty for checking email on a Sunday, relax. You're not defying God. You're just honoring the medieval legacy of working when you're technically not supposed to. And if your boss emails you about it, just tell them your dough turned into snakes. When someone calls you sir or ma'am, it feels polite, even respectful. But back in the Middle Ages, those words didn't mean, "I respect you." They meant, "I recognize you could legally have me executed." Titles of address were like the linguistic armor of feudal Europe. The Renaissance brought a revival of the human form, and artists embraced it with an enthusiasm that occasionally forgot where beauty ended and blasphemy began. Take Raphael, Rome's golden boy. His frescoes glowed with serenity, but behind the serenity lay a man famously incapable of resisting temptation. His muse, La Fornerina, was a baker's daughter whose curves inspired half his Madonnas. She became his obsession, his hidden partner, and, depending on who you asked, the true model for the Virgin Mary herself. When Raphael died young, rumors spread that it wasn't from fever, but from exhaustion after a night of overzealous artistic study. Michelangelo, in contrast, wrestled with guilt as much as marble. His figures on the Sistine Chapel ceiling were technically biblical, but no one could miss how lovingly he sculpted every muscle and curve. Some church officials grumbled that his saints looked a bit too human. Michelangelo's defenders called it divine anatomy. His critics called it pornography. The man himself prayed, sculpted, and agonized, torn between devotion and the undeniable beauty of the body. And then came the real rebels, Caravaggio chief among them. His art glowed with divine light, but dripped with human vice. His models were often prostitutes and thieves pulled straight from the streets, their raw sensuality painted onto the faces of saints and martyrs. To him, holiness and sin were inseparable twins. His Judith beheading Holofernes was painted with such violence and erotic tension that viewers couldn't decide whether to cross themselves or look away. For every sacred commission, there was an unholy inspiration. Artists were paid by the church to glorify God, but in doing so, they also glorified the human body, the very thing the church warned against. Their studios were confessionals with paint and skin instead of rosaries. In Renaissance Rome, art wasn't just decoration. It was temptation made visible. The sand clung to your face like ashes, and your hands trembled from the strain. But above the din, one thing was clear. The crowd was chanting. Perhaps not loudly, not yet. But you heard it, your name. And it was only the beginning. Victory in the circus was intoxicating, more powerful than thunder, sweeter than wine. When you won, the crowd's roar consumed you. Women threw garlands, gamblers wept with joy, and the emperor himself might offer a nod of approval. You would return to the stables like a conquering general, your horses steaming with sweat and pride. For a slave or freedman, no triumph in Rome could compare. In a single afternoon, you could earn what a soldier made in 10 years, and with victory came everything else. Fame, gold, desire. Patrons lined up to sponsor you, politicians sought your friendship, and poets immortalized your name on wax tablets. The city whispered about your skill, your luck, your supposed charm. Even noblewomen, bored with their husbands and arranged dinners, sent you secret messages. To Rome, you were no longer a man. You were a myth with a pulse. But the higher you rose, the sharper the knives became. Jealousy was the second language of the circus. Rivals plotted accidents. Fans rioted if their faction lost. And the same crowd that cheered for you today would curse your name tomorrow. You learned to smile cautiously and sleep lightly. Glory had a distinct scent, and so did betrayal. Your winnings bought you freedom from your master, but not from danger. Free men could race under their own names, and many did, until they died tangled in the reins or crushed beneath the horses. Statues were erected for the lucky ones, but most ended up broken, their bodies buried in unmarked graves outside the city walls. Every lap you raced was a bet against the gods, and they rarely paid out twice. Their success was invisible, their failure catastrophic. They didn't wear crowns, but they held the kingdom together. Every brick of the pyramids, every loaf of bread in a worker's hands, began with their measurements. They bridged the gap between gods and men, between chaos and control. Their mathematics flowed downstream into the very structure of Egypt itself. In a world ruled by divine order, they were the quiet priests of precision, the architects not of temples but of life. To the ancient Egyptians, the Nile wasn't just a river, it was a living god. Its floods were divine moods, its currents sacred speech. They called it Happy, the bringer of abundance, the lord of fish and grain, the blue-skinned deity whose body ran through the veins of Egypt itself. Every drop of water was his blessing, and every drought his silence. When the flood came each year, priests led ceremonies at the riverbanks. Offerings of bread, beer, and flowers floated downstream, meant to please Happy and coax him into generosity. In the temples of Thebes and Memphis, Hymns were sung not to conquerors or kings, but to the river that sustained them all. You flood the fields, they chanted. You give life to all that lives. You are the god of bread. The flood wasn't chaos. It was divine order in motion, a proof that Ma'at, the universal balance, still governed the world. If the waters rose too high or too low, it was a warning that harmony had been broken. The pharaoh, as the earthly embodiment of Ma'at, carried the sacred duty of maintaining that balance. When the Nile failed, so did his legitimacy. The river wasn't just water. It was politics, theology, and prophecy woven together. Yet the Egyptians didn't fear the Nile the way others feared their gods. They revered it with familiarity, almost tenderness. They painted Hapi as neither male nor female, but both fertile, round-bellied, generous. He symbolized abundance without violence, creation without conquest. It showed up in Western Europe around the 11th century, brought by rich Byzantine nobles who used small golden versions to eat small bites of food without getting their hands messy. Makes sense, right? Wrong. The church totally freaked out. Clergymen declared that using a fork was an insult to God because, according to them, the Almighty had already provided the perfect eating tools. Fingers. The idea that someone might prefer metal over flesh was seen as bordering on blasphemy. One famous story involves a Byzantine princess who married into the Venetian royal family. She brought her gold forks with her, and the local priests lost it. When she died of the plague shortly after, the clergy smugly declared that her death was divine punishment for daring to use a shiny pronged stick instead of her God-given digits. For centuries, Europeans kept eating with their hands like cavemen in fancy clothes. Even nobles during the Renaissance were hesitant to use forks because it just seemed weird. Knives and spoons were fine. One stabbed, one scooped, both biblical enough. But the fork just had bad vibes. Ironically, people also started dying from foodborne illnesses because, surprise, surprise, dirty fingers aren't that hygienic. But no amount of dysentery could change the church's mind. God made hands, therefore use them. It wasn't until the 17th century, when the trendy elites in Italy decided forks were elegant, that the rest of Europe caved. And, as always, the English were the last to jump on board, calling forks effeminate until some important person used one in public. So, the next time you sit down at a table and politely twirl your pasta, remember this: you're doing something that was once seen as morally wrong. The medieval church fought against sanitation, elegance, and basic table manners, and they lost. Society was basically a human pyramid, with kings at the top, peasants at the bottom, and everyone else squashed somewhere in between. Calling someone sir, short for sire, from the old French seigneur, was how you acknowledged that they owned your land, your livelihood, and possibly your spine. It wasn't optional either. If you met a noble and forgot to bow or didn't use their title, it wasn't just a social faux pas. It was a crime. Etiquette manuals from the 14th century actually warned that a person of low standing had to speak to their superiors with reverence, under penalty of correction, which, of course, was medieval for public humiliation and a light beating. Women had their own version, madame, short for madame, literally meaning my lady. That wasn't a term of affection. It was ownership language. It told everyone that this woman belonged to a social class above yours, usually because she belonged to an actual man above yours. Over time, the titles softened. The nobles lost their fiefdoms, and sir and ma'am trickled down the hierarchy until they became meaningless courtesies. Today, we use them for cashiers, customers, and people who block the grocery aisle. Small verbal nods to a social order that technically doesn't exist anymore, but emotionally still does. Americans use them to sound polite, while the British use them to sound superior. And in the South, sir and ma'am can mean anything from genuine respect to the verbal equivalent of a slap, depending on the tone. It's linguistic evolution in action. Feudal submission repackaged as customer service. So, the next time someone calls you sir or ma'am, remember you've just been addressed like a medieval landlord. You didn't earn that authority. You inherited the vocabulary. And when you say it to someone else, you're not being polite. You're just reenacting feudalism with better manners and worse tips. Each brushstroke was a gamble between salvation and scandal. And as frescoes bloomed across the city's walls, so too did the rumor that God's greatest masterpiece was not the soul, but the naked human form. If you wanted to glimpse the true soul of Renaissance Rome, not the marble statues or papal decrees, but the pulsing, laughing, sinful heart, you went during Carnival. For a few days each year, Rome forgot its morals and remembered its appetites. Masks hid faces, wine replaced sermons, and the line between priest and peasant vanished under the glitter of torchlight. During Carnival, even the church relaxed its grip. Cardinals attended masquerades to observe the youth, which usually meant chasing dancers until dawn. Monks wandered the streets drunk on spiced wine, quoting scripture with the confidence of men who hadn't read it recently. Even the Pope, safely behind Vatican walls, was said to peer from balconies, amused by his city's annual descent into chaos. The streets overflowed with symbolism and sin. Floats carried allegories of virtue defeating vice, though most spectators rooted for vice. Courtesans disguised themselves as nuns. Nuns disguised themselves as courtesans, and both seemed to enjoy the confusion. Confessionals filled up the next week, priests shaking their heads solemnly while taking careful notes on who had done what with whom, and what of those confessions. They became Rome's unofficial gossip network. A penitent might confess her affair with a married cardinal only to find her sins recited back to her later by a smirking servant. Secrets had a short lifespan in the Eternal City. One monk even joked that in Rome, the Holy Spirit didn't descend as a dove. It arrived as a rumor. The contradiction was spectacular. Sin was punished and celebrated at once. Carnival parades passed beneath frescoes of the Last Judgment. The same hands that tossed roses into the crowd clasped rosaries the next morning. And yet, no amount of gold or safety could match the sensation of standing before the crowd. Your hand raised in victory, the laurel crown pressed against your hair. You would look up at the marble stands, see the nobles who had once ignored you, and feel their envy like the warmth of the sun. For a few stolen moments, you were no longer a slave or a mortal. You were the very pulse of Rome itself. Then you would leave the track, still trembling from the speed, knowing that tomorrow could bring it all to an end. But as you brushed your horses and cleaned the dust from their manes, you whispered the same vow that every charioteer made. Let me die fast, but let me die famous. Rome's heart didn't beat for emperors or legions. It beat for colors. Blue versus green, red versus white. These weren't just racing teams. They were tribes, cults, armies of passion that divided neighborhoods and shattered reason. The city's loyalties were painted in vibrant colors. A man might forgive an insult to his mother, but never an insult to his faction. As a driver for the Blues, you wore their color like armor. To the faithful, you were a hero. To the Greens, you were the enemy. Fans scrawled your name on tavern walls, sang songs about your victories, and started fights over your honor. When you walked through the markets, mothers pointed you out to their sons. But you also learned to travel with your cloak pulled low, because in the wrong part of town, admiration could quickly turn into assassination. The factions were more than just sport. They were politics. Senators funded teams, emperors played favorites, and riots erupted when races turned bloody. The Circus Maximus had its own brand of war and diplomacy. A sabotaged will could ignite street brawls. A disputed victory could set an entire district ablaze. When the Greens accused your faction of bribing an official, the city exploded. By nightfall, torches illuminated the Forum, and the Tiber River ran red with faction blood. Even death was tied to his gift. When the flood receded, the rich black silt it left behind was called Kemet, the Black Land. It was from this word that Egypt took its ancient name. Festivals marked the inundation's arrival like the dawn of a new year. Children danced in the streets, farmers sang as they repaired their dikes, and priests announced the rising waters with drums and incense. For a few precious weeks, Egypt was united, not by ruler or war, but by water. The Nile's rhythm wasn't simply agricultural. It was spiritual architecture. Each rise and fall was a heartbeat in the body of a god. And through that god, Egypt found immortality. Empires would rise and crumble, but as long as Happy returned, life and faith would begin again. Every summer, As the Nile's floodwaters spread across Egypt, they carried a silent gift, fine black silt. To the Egyptians, this wasn't mere mud. It was the river's voice, the language of creation itself. When the waters withdrew, they left behind a thin, glistening layer of life, rich with minerals from mountains far to the south. This black soil, Kemet, was the difference between feast and famine, between civilization and sand. The farmers knew its texture by touch alone. A handful of Nile silt, smooth and dark, was worth more than gold. It grew wheat, barley, flax, papyrus, everything that fed both body and empire. Each family had its plot marked by ridges of earth that trapped the water. Once the floods receded, oxen plowed the damp fields, and workers cast seeds into the gleaming mud. Within weeks, the land erupted into green, a miracle so regular it felt divine. Scribes recorded each year's yield, comparing it to the height of the flood. From these notes, patterns emerged. Low floods meant thin harvests and rising grain prices. Generous floods meant surplus and stability. Over centuries, this quiet observation became science. Egyptian farmers didn't just plant, they forecasted, which, in a poetic way, makes every dinner involving cutlery a small victory for common sense over organized superstition. Or, as the priests would have called it, temptation served on silver. If you think bachelor parties are wild today, just picture them with swords. In the Middle Ages, before marriage was about love or sharing Netflix accounts, it was basically a financial deal. But even way back then, guys couldn't help but have one last night of bad decisions before signing their lives away. That's how the medieval stag night, the original bachelor party, was born. Knights would get together in taverns or manor houses, drink ale until their helmets didn't fit anymore, gamble away their horses, and loudly declare their eternal love for freedom, which usually lasted about 8 hours. These parties were supposed to be a way to honor the groom's transition into responsibility. But in reality, they were just an excuse to see how much a guy could drink before passing out in a moat. The stag was a symbol of virility and wildness, which is the medieval way of saying drunken regret. Guests would raise a toast to the groom's bravery for getting married, while secretly taking bets on how long he'd survive domestic life. Someone would inevitably challenge someone else to a duel, and at least one guy would mistake the bride's cousin for a barmaid. The church naturally hated these parties. Priests called them feasts of sin, which, to be fair, was pretty accurate. They warned that getting drunk before marriage would lead to damnation. The knights, of course, took that as a challenge. Over time, the tradition trickled down from nobles to townsfolk, who swapped castles for taverns and armor for leather shoes. But the vibe stayed the same. Eat, drink, and act like a fool, because tomorrow you're legally obligated not to. Even the morning after rituals were pretty familiar. There were hangovers, awkward silences, and promises never to speak of what happened. If you've ever waited in line for a permit, signed a form that needed 3 other signatures, or emailed someone just circling back, you owe that experience to the Middle Ages. Bureaucracy, humanity's favorite way to look organized while doing absolutely nothing, was a medieval invention. Back then, kings couldn't run kingdoms all by themselves. They needed literate people who could write down who owed taxes, who owned land, and who had been executed recently. Thus, the first clerks appeared, men in robes with quills, ink, and a supernatural ability to make small problems take forever. The church really perfected it. Every tithe, sin, confession, and miracle had to be recorded, stamped, and filed in triplicate. Medieval monasteries were the original offices, candlelit cubicles filled with unpaid interns called novices. Their handwriting was exquisite, but their morale was definitely not. By the 12th century, royal administrations had joined in. England's kings employed armies of scribes to record every cow, fence, and human soul in the realm. The result was the Doomsday Book, history's first database. Though slightly less searchable, it was meant to organize the kingdom. Mostly, it organized confusion. Soon, every government in Europe copied the idea. If something existed, it needed a form. Property disputes spawned scrolls longer than marriages. Births, deaths, and taxes all required signatures, seals, and witnesses. Losing your paperwork was practically treason. The real genius of medieval bureaucracy was its ability to create work for itself. For every law you needed a record, for every record, a clerk, and for every clerk, another clerk to check the first one's handwriting. It was a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem, a paper-based perpetual motion machine powered entirely by frustration. Fast forward to the modern world, and nothing has really changed. The faithful blamed human weakness, as though weakness were the city's favorite sport. When the festivities ended, Rome washed its face and put its halo back on. The priests thundered about virtue, the nobles returned to their marriages, and the streets smelled again of incense instead of sweat and wine. But the memory lingered. Behind every saintly procession was a hangover, and beneath every Ave Maria whispered in penance, there lurked a quiet, knowing smile, because everyone in Rome understood one thing. Forgiveness came cheap, but the pleasures of sin were priceless. No discussion of Renaissance Rome's moral collapse would be complete without the Borgias, the family that turned sin into statecraft. If ordinary Romans gossiped about lust and greed, the Borgias patented it. Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, ruled not like a shepherd of souls, but like the godfather of an Italian crime syndicate, if the crime syndicate also issued indulgences. His Vatican was a stage for decadence. Witnesses spoke of banquets where courtesans dined naked, of rooms draped in silk and perfumed with scandal. One particularly infamous night, later dubbed the Banquet of Chestnuts, featured 50 dancers, cardinals tossing roasted chestnuts onto the floor, and guests crawling to collect them in a display of shameless indulgence. Whether the story was exaggerated hardly mattered. Rome believed it, and that was enough. Rodrigo's children were the real proof of his dual legacy. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's favorite son, was charming, handsome, and entirely ruthless. He murdered rivals with the same efficiency his father used to grant pardons. Cesari's sister, Lucrezia, became a legend in her own right, accused of incest, poisonings, and seductions, though much of it was likely propaganda spread by enemies. Still, her ability to manipulate the men around her, husbands, lovers, even popes, made her one of the most dangerous women in Europe. Even the emperors feared the factions. They weren't mere fans, they were Rome's other army. Charioteers like you held the power to either pacify or ignite them. Once, after a series of your victories, the emperor himself invited you to dine in his palace, not out of admiration, but out of caution. He wanted to ensure that your fame served the throne, rather than threatening it. You smiled, bowed, and toasted to Rome, pretending not to notice his guards tightening their grips. But amidst the rivalries, there was one face that haunted you, your counterpart in green, a charioteer named Felix. He was fast, brutal, and fearless. The crowd called him the Serpent. Each race between you wasn't a competition. It was a war. You'd lock eyes at the starting line, each knowing that only one of you would leave the circus alive that day. The colors, the cheers, the glory. It was all blood and illusion. Rome didn't love its heroes. It devoured them. And as long as the crowd demanded danger, the circus would provide it, one crash, one corpse, one color at a time. The circus looked magnificent from the stands, but from the chariot, it was a slaughterhouse. Death came swiftly, loudly, and mercilessly. One broken wheel, one frightened horse, and it was over. The Romans even had a word for it, naufragium, a shipwreck, because that's what a crash resembled. With splintering like waves, bodies flung into the air, and screams swallowed by the crowd's roar. You witnessed your first one at the age of 16. The driver ahead of you misjudged his turn around the spina. His wheel clipped the barrier, shattered, and sent his chariot spinning wildly. The horses panicked, dragging him by the reins as his body bounced across the sand like a broken doll. You smelled the blood before you even saw it. The crowd erupted, not in horror, but in ecstasy. Death was their favorite finish line. Every race was a gamble with fate. They learned to listen to the silt, to read its weight, color, and spread. The texture of the soil even shaped Egypt's cities. Villages rose on higher ground to escape the floods, while fields stretched in long ribbons along the riverbanks. The narrow green valley, hemmed in by desert, created a sense of focus, a civilization perfectly balanced between chaos and order. Each year, the Nile erased and redrew the landscape, forcing Egypt to adapt, to rebuild, to remember. In a way, the flood wrote history. Temples and tombs were built of limestone, but the foundation of Egypt's story was mud. Wet, black, eternal. Even the pigment on their frescoes came from the same silt that nourished their crops. The Nile wasn't just feeding Egypt, it was painting it. When foreigners saw the river's bounty, they envied its magic. But to the Egyptians, there was nothing supernatural about it. It was partnership, not miracle. The Nile gave, and they listened. The silt was the handwriting of the gods, and Egypt learned to read it fluently year after year. Controlling the Nile's gift required more than reverence. It demanded precision. The Egyptians turned their worship into engineering, transforming the natural flood into a system of managed abundance. What began as simple canals grew into a network of hydraulic machinery that stretched from the delta to Nubia. It was a living circuit where every basin, dike, and channel played its part in Egypt's grand equation of survival. At the heart of this system were the basin fields, vast rectangular enclosures bordered by earthen embankments. When the floodwaters rose, the channels filled these basins in careful sequence. Water lingered for weeks, soaking the soil before being drained into the next enclosure. The process mimicked the river's natural flow, but under human command. The result was controlled fertility, a man-made imitation of the Nile's pulse. Lifting water was the next challenge. The only real difference between then and now is that medieval guys didn't have smartphones to record the evidence. So, when you see a modern groom stumbling out of a bar wearing a plastic crown and a look of regret, you're witnessing history. It's the same tradition, just without the swords, the plague, and the moral judgment of a guy named Sir Geoffrey trying to juggle flaming torches while yelling about love. Bachelor parties didn't evolve. They just went from chainmail to matching t-shirts. And somewhere, a medieval monk is still praying for all of them. When someone passes away today, we automatically wear black. Feels respectful, somber, even timeless. But the truth is, it's really just a medieval fashion trend that got way out of hand. The color people wore for mourning actually used to depend on where you were. The Romans wore white to funerals, clean, symbolic, and good for reflecting sunlight while you grieved under the Italian sun. But medieval Europe looked at that and said, "Nah, let's make sadness depressing and stylish." Black dye was expensive back then, which meant only the wealthy could afford to look properly devastated. Peasants, of course, couldn't really afford grief in fabric form, so they wore whatever was clean, which, let's be honest, was probably nothing. The nobles, though, turned mourning into a whole production. Dressed in black wool and veils, they'd wail dramatically through the streets, because grief, like everything else, had to be over the top. The church was all about it. Black symbolized humility before God. And, conveniently, it made the clergy's clothing choices look holy instead of just lazy. Over time, the color of mourning spread to all social classes, because nothing says repentance like wearing something that soaks up both heat and despair. By the 14th century, black funerals were a major power move. Kings died in black. Widows lived in black. Entire royal courts spent years in coordinated sadness. We've swapped parchment for PDFs, quills for keyboards, and seals for email signatures, but the spirit remains. You still need permission to do things that no one actually understands. So, the next time you're stuck on hold or filling out a form that asks for the same information 5 times, take comfort in knowing you're part of a 1,000-year-old tradition. Medieval kings had scrolls and you have spreadsheets. Both are equally meaningless, but at least yours has a submit button. If you think outrage culture was invented on Twitter, you clearly haven't met a medieval villager with spare time and access to a church bell. The Middle Ages ran entirely on moral panic. There was no news cycle, no trending tab, just priests, rumors, and the occasional goat acting suspiciously. One person saw a comet. Another blamed the local widow for it. And suddenly, half the town was on fire. Back then, society didn't need proof. It needed someone to blame. Drought? Witches. Illness? Witches. Bread didn't rise? Definitely witches. It was a one-size-fits-all explanation for everything that went wrong. And if no witches were available, heretics or foreigners would do just fine. The church fueled this with industrial efficiency. Panic was good for attendance. If you could convince people that sin caused plagues and heresy caused earthquakes, they'd tithe more. Call it medieval crowdfunding for divine protection. Inquisitors traveled from town to town, purging corruption, which mostly meant asking leading questions until someone confessed to dancing with the devil. Public hysteria was entertainment, too. Witch trials were community events. People brought snacks. The same folks who cheered at executions would spend the next morning praying for mercy. A perfect balance of guilt and spectacle. And let's be honest, not much has changed. We've just replaced the gallows with comment sections and the torches with Wi-Fi. The Borgias blurred every line between holiness and hedonism. Their private vices spilled into public policy. Cardinals were appointed through bribery. Sins were forgiven for gold. And marriage alliances were sealed with sheets instead of signatures. Rome had seen corrupt popes before, but never one who treated the papacy like a family business. Yet, in their defense, the Borgias were simply more open about what everyone else was doing in secret. While other families hid their excesses behind Latin sermons, the Borgias wore theirs proudly, gilded and perfumed. They transformed the Vatican into both a brothel and a battlefield, depending on the day. When Alexander VI finally died, ironically, after a banquet, Rome sighed in relief, but also in admiration. He had been a sinner, yes, but an unforgettable one. His reign left the church stained, his name cursed, but his legend immortal. In Renaissance Rome, the Borgias proved a timeless truth. In the right hands, sin could be the ultimate power. For all its outrage and sermons, the church in Renaissance Rome was not merely a victim of sin. It was its enabler. The hierarchy thundered against lust from the pulpit, but behind those marble walls, coin purses clinked louder than conscience. Every indulgence sold and absolution granted was part of a vast forgiveness economy. You could sleep with your mistress, confess the next morning, and emerge spiritually spotless, provided your donation was substantial. This wasn't about being two-faced. It was purely business. Sin, after all, was a dependable source of revenue. The Vatican's vaults overflowed with funds from individuals seeking redemption for pleasures they fully intended to indulge in again. In a way, the church had transformed desire into a subscription service. Sin, confess, pay, repeat. Even the printing of indulgence certificates became a booming industry. Monks who should have been illuminating Bibles were instead busy counting money. You learned to watch for the warning signs. The flicker in a horse's gait, the wobble in a rival's wheel, the tension in the reins. You trained yourself to react faster than thought, to steer by instinct when reason would falter. The circus punished hesitation. A mediocre charioteer died quickly. A great one learned to make death his ally. The crashes were often worse near the meaty, the turning posts. Drivers fought for the inside lane where victory lived and disaster lurked. You hugged the curve so tightly that you could feel the marble scraping against your axle. Too wide, and you'd lose the race. Too tight, and you'd join the wreckage. There was no middle ground, only glory or ruin. Sometimes, when a crash occurred behind you, the screams faded beneath the pounding of hooves. You never looked back. To survive, you had to be ruthless. Compassion was for poets and priests, not for men who raced against the gods. You told yourself that each crash was another sacrifice to Neptune, god of horses, and whispered a prayer that it would never be your turn. But every driver knew the truth. Luck was a rope that was always fraying. One day you'd feel it snap, and when it did, the circus would keep roaring, the crowd would keep cheering, and Rome would move on, its appetite for blood as limitless as its thirst for speed. If death was always just around the corner, fortune resided just beyond it. For the few who survived long enough, chariot racing was the quickest path from slavery to unimaginable wealth. Rome adored its winners with the same fervor it reserved for crucifying its losers. You began as property, but with each victory, you became something rarer. A man who controlled his own destiny. Your winnings accumulated faster than the crowds could chant your name. Bags of silver, laurel crowns, fine cloaks, and golden goblets, spoils that were once reserved for conquering generals, were now yours. You bought your freedom first, then your house, then your own horses. The shaduf, a counterbalanced lever with a bucket at one end and a weight at the other, revolutionized irrigation. With it, a single farmer could raise hundreds of liters of water a day from canals to higher terraces. Later came the sequia, a wooden wheel turned by oxen, its pots scooping and pouring in endless rhythm. These devices were simple but brilliant, powered by muscle and geometry rather than magic. Every flood season required coordination on a national scale. Laborers repaired dikes and dredged canals under orders from local governors who reported to royal engineers in Memphis. The pharaoh's decrees flowed downstream like the water itself, ensuring that every village along the river contributed to the balance. A breach in one province could doom another hundreds of miles away. Even temples were part of the system. Priests used nilometers, vertical shafts with carved cubit marks, to measure water levels. From these readings, they could predict crop yields, tax revenues, and the empire's stability for the year ahead. Science, religion, and politics converged at the waterline. The Nile's machinery wasn't made of bronze or stone. It was made of people. Tens of thousands worked in synchrony, guided by the river's tempo. Egypt's true marvel wasn't a pyramid or a sphinx. It was this invisible infrastructure. A civilization built not to fight nature, but to think like it. The flood was eternal, but so was their genius in mastering it. Long after the pharaohs were gone and their temples swallowed by sand, the Nile kept its rhythm. The same flood that carried papyrus boats and golden barges in the time of Ramses still rose and fell centuries later, watched by farmers who no longer knew the names of the gods but still depended on their river's mercy. Egypt's monuments weathered and crumbled, yet its greatest creation, the harnessing of water, never stopped working. The techniques that once fed the pyramids' builders became templates for civilizations that followed. Queen Victoria later brought the custom back centuries later, staying in mourning black for 40 years, a record-breaking emotional hostage situation. Of course, the color eventually lost its religious meaning and just stuck. Now, we all show up to funerals dressed like accountants who messed up eternity on their taxes, because the Middle Ages decided grief needed a dress code. Ironically, the rest of the world didn't follow suit. In much of Asia, mourners still wear white, the color of purity. In Africa, bright colors celebrate a life well lived. Meanwhile, in the West, we're busy looking like a collective tax audit for the deceased. So, the next time you attend a funeral in black, remember you're not tapping into timeless reverence. You're just following a 1,000-year-old medieval fashion rule invented by rich people trying to look holy. And like with all fashion trends, it's never really been about the dead. It's about showing that you cared more stylishly than everyone else. The handshake, that sacred gesture of modern civility, professionalism, and the occasional exchange of bacteria, seems polite, friendly, even human. But its roots are, like most medieval customs, deeply suspicious. Back in the Middle Ages, people didn't shake hands to say hello. They did it to say, "Please don't murder me." Medieval Europe was a paranoid place. Everyone carried weapons. Everyone owed someone else a favor. And everyone's cousin was plotting a coup. So, when two men met, they'd extend their right hands to show they weren't holding a dagger. The shaking part came later, a little theatrical wiggle to make sure there wasn't a knife hidden up the sleeve. It was less of a greeting and more of a mutual weapons check. Knights, merchants, and even kings did it, although usually with a sword hand that was probably trembling from the effort of pretending to trust someone. Someone makes a mistake, everyone piles on, and by sunset, there's digital shouting, moral superiority, and no actual solutions. The same rhythm, just with better spelling. Medieval panic kept order through fear, while modern panic keeps engagement through algorithms. Both make you feel righteous while achieving absolutely nothing. It's a tradition so resilient it survived plagues, printing presses, and the Enlightenment and still thrives every time someone says, "I can't believe you'd post that." Renaissance Rome was supposed to be the beating heart of holiness, a city where saints prayed, pilgrims wept, and divine light bathed every corner. But if you peeled back the gilded facade of marble and fresco, you'd find something entirely different. A place where desire ruled just as powerfully as faith. The same bells that called the faithful to Mass also tolled over a city drunk on its own vices. By the early 1500s, the Holy City was a paradox. Pilgrims arrived seeking salvation, yet the streets reeked of perfume and wine. The taverns around Piazza Navona were full of priests who had clearly forgotten their vows of chastity and possibly sobriety. Noblemen strutted in velvet doublets, while courtesans leaned from their balconies, laughing as the church bells rang. Even confession, meant to cleanse the soul, became an erotic ritual whispered behind lattice screens. Everywhere you looked, temptation was sponsored by the very institutions meant to suppress it. Monks dabbled in alchemy and spent more time brewing aphrodisiacal potions than copying scripture. Nuns exchanged love letters hidden in the pages of psalters. Bishops hosted banquets that would make the pagan emperors blush, complete with roasted peacock, dancing girls, and wine that never seemed to stop flowing. And at the center of it all stood the Vatican itself, the fortress of morality, or so it claimed. Cardinals owned sprawling vineyards, lent money at interest, and maintained lavish estates staffed with servants and lovers. One bishop was so notorious for his illegitimate children that the locals jokingly referred to his palace as the house of the Lord and his extended family. Yet, these very same men presided over inquisitions and moral trials, condemning ordinary people for sins that were practically Vatican traditions. When voices calling for reform began to surface, with monks whispering that the church had lost its way, they were silenced or banished. It was a dangerous thing to accuse God's representatives of behaving like merchants. Nevertheless, rumors of papal indulgences and corruption spread like wildfire. Even the faithful started to raise eyebrows when priests warned against temptation. They'd witnessed too many sermons conclude at the local bar. The irony was almost too much to bear. The more the church denounced sin, the more it depended on it. Without lust, greed, and guilt, half of Rome's economy and the entire Vatican would have crumbled overnight. Some individuals tried to reform the system from within. A few honest friars spoke out against the corruption, only to be ignored, transferred to remote locations, or mysteriously fall ill. Others simply accepted that Rome's holiness was, at best, theoretical. As one weary priest wrote in his journal, "We do not live in the city of God, but in the city God pretends not to notice." And so, beneath thousands of candles and painted images of saints, the church continued its elaborate performance. Half prayer, half indulgence, and entirely human. By the end of the Renaissance, Rome had perfected the art of appearing holy. Every street corner had a shrine, every family had a confessor, and every sinner had a carefully crafted excuse. Virtue was no longer a state of the soul. It was a carefully chosen outfit. Men who had once spat at your feet now bowed when you entered the tavern. Senators nodded to you in the forum, pretending they didn't recall the brand on your skin from your days as a slave. You smiled, knowing that they did. Women followed too, some out of love, but most drawn to the legend. Courtesans, noble widows, even priestesses found excuses to pray with you. Fame transformed everything you touched into excess. Banquets stretched until dawn, your name echoing in drunken toasts. You spent money as freely as sand through your fingers, because the gods had made you swift, but not immortal. And yet, the higher you climbed, the lonelier the air became. Friends morphed into flatterers, admirers into thieves. You realized that Rome didn't love you. It loved the idea of you, the man who cheated death, who tamed thunder, who could make the city forget its hunger for just one glorious afternoon. Still, you couldn't stop. Fortune was an addiction you couldn't shake. The circus was your temple, and each race was another prayer to keep your luck alive. You invested in your own team, hired grooms, and even trained younger drivers. Some called you Dominus Origi, Lord of the Charioteers. Sounded noble, but you knew better. Beneath the gold and applause, the same truth burned. Your empire rested on spinning wheels and frightened horses. At feasts, poets recited your name alongside Hercules and Achilles. You laughed, but deep down the comparison chilled you. Heroes never had long lives in Rome. They burned brightly, then vanished. and you knew that one day, whether by age, accident, or envy, the circus would reclaim everything it had given. Fortune was generous, but she always demanded her due. Time caught up with every charioteer, no matter how fast his horses ran. Your hands, once strong enough to control a team of stallions, began to tremble when you held the reins. The cheers that had once lifted your soul now seemed distant, as if muffled behind the roar of memory. Greek engineers studied Egyptian canals. Roman surveyors borrowed their measuring cords. Medieval farmers across the Mediterranean used shadufs and sakia wheels almost unchanged. Even the word nilometer survived as a concept long after its readings were carved in cubits. Egypt had turned the simple act of irrigation into a science, and the world never forgot the lesson. But the Nile's power was always double-edged. Too much control and the river withered. Too little and chaos returned. Later rulers tried to command it the way the pharaohs had, with bureaucracy instead of divinity, but the balance was delicate. The British centuries later would build dams to regulate its floods, continuing a dialogue that began thousands of years before with baskets of mud and stone embankments. Even modern engineers in Cairo studying satellite data and water flow are heirs to those ancient surveyors who measured with ropes and stars. The true legacy of the Nile isn't in monuments or myths. It's in a mindset. The Egyptians learned early that mastery of nature doesn't come through conquest, but through rhythm. They treated the flood not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a partner to be understood. Their success was measured not in conquests but in continuity. The ability to keep life flowing year after year, generation after generation. Every civilization dreams of eternity. Egypt quietly achieved it through water. The same patterns of canals, crops, and villages seen from the sky today mirror those etched into tomb walls 3,000 years ago. The Nile still flows north, still leaves its mark in silt and shadow, still murmurs the same ancient promise. Follow my rhythm, and I will make you eternal. In the end, Egypt's greatest monument wasn't carved from stone. It was engineered from the river itself. And, naturally, the left-handed minority, who were always seen as suspicious, were considered untrustworthy simply because their sword was on the other side. Medieval logic, always flawless. By the 16th century, it had evolved into a formal greeting among gentlemen, replacing bows and those awkward silences that everyone hates. It became a symbol of equality, a way of saying, we're both free men, capable of stabbing each other, but choosing not to. Fast forward a few centuries, and the handshake somehow became professional. Business people turned it from a survival tactic into a networking ritual. The same gesture that was once used to make sure no one was hiding a weapon now seals multi-million-dollar deals, which, let's be honest, are just the modern version of jewel heists, only slower and with more lawyers. Even the pandemic couldn't kill it. Doctors told us to stop shaking hands, and we all just said, nah, we'd rather risk the plague than look rude. Which is a pretty medieval way of thinking, really. So, the next time someone squeezes your hand too hard at a meeting, remember what they're really saying. I come in peace. For now. The handshake isn't a symbol of trust. It's a leftover from a time when trust could get you stabbed. And, when you think about how business works, maybe things haven't changed that much after all. If you've ever been told to chew with your mouth closed, not to talk while eating, or to stop licking the knife, congratulations. You're practicing ancient survival skills that were invented by medieval people who were tired of dying during dinner. See, table manners weren't created because someone wanted to look fancy. They started because dining in the Middle Ages was horrifying. Picture a long wooden table covered in greasy trenches, basically edible plates made of stale bread with everyone using the same knife, the same bowl, and the same fingers. You didn't have your own utensils. You just had to hope for the best. The papal palace was draped in virtue by day, but at night its corridors flickered with candlelight and laughter. Servants swore they saw mistresses slipping through secret doors, and rumors spread of cardinals fathering more children than they could count. Rome, the city of saints, had turned itself into a Renaissance version of Las Vegas, if Las Vegas charged indulgences and quoted scripture while doing it. Yet no one seemed truly scandalized. Hypocrisy had become an art form. A priest might preach about lust in the morning, visit his mistress in the afternoon, and commission a painting of the Virgin Mary that suspiciously resembled her by evening. It was an age where holiness was worn like jewelry, sparkling in the light, tarnished in the dark. Rome called itself the Eternal City, but at the peak of the Renaissance, the Vatican was less a monastery and more a royal court, complete with drama, ego, and scandal worthy of a soap opera. The Pope wasn't just God's representative on earth. He was often the richest, most powerful man in Italy, and sometimes the most corrupt. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the reigns of the so-called papal playboys, men who mixed sacred duty with personal pleasure as easily as wine with water. Take Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose name became synonymous with sin wrapped in silk. He fathered at least 8 children officially. Unofficially, well, Rome lost count. His mistress, the beautiful Venazia dei Catanii, lived openly in a palazzo near the Vatican, while his other lover, Giulia Farnese, was called the Pope's concubine by half of Europe. And while he preached virtue, his son, Cesare Borgia, carved a trail of blood across Italy, and his daughter, Lucrezia, was whispered to poison her lovers at banquets. The Borgias didn't hide their vices. They flaunted them in velvet robes embroidered with the family crest. But Alexander wasn't alone in his spiritual flexibility. The city wore it with pride, stitched with silk, pearls, and just enough incense to mask the stench of hypocrisy. Men strode into church carrying prayer books in one hand and love letters in the other. Women made the sign of the cross during Mass while discreetly making eye contact with their lovers a few pews away. Artists painted angels with the faces of their mistresses. Popes commissioned elaborate altarpieces to atone for the extravagant parties they had hosted the night before. Everyone in Rome was an actor, and the stage was divine. The clever ones understood the rules of the game. You didn't have to be virtuous, you simply had to appear to be. A tearful confession, a generous donation to the poor, a pious expression whenever sin was mentioned. Reputation was the currency of the city, and everyone guarded theirs more closely than their souls. If you sinned discreetly, you were simply human. If you were caught, you were doomed. Even morality itself became a fashionable trend. Religious relics were traded like precious jewelry. Pilgrimages became social gatherings, and charity was the Renaissance equivalent of public relations. When noblemen funded the construction of new churches, it wasn't out of piety. It was for prestige. A fresco depicting the Last Judgment could cleanse your legacy more effectively than 1,000 prayers. The Vatican called it faith. Rome called it strategy. Yet, amidst all this duplicity, there was something almost beautiful. The city was corrupt, yes, but it was also vibrantly alive. Passion and hypocrisy danced together in perfect harmony, giving rise to art, architecture, and ideas that continue to fascinate the world. For every sin whispered in the shadows, a masterpiece was born in the light. In the end, Renaissance Rome wasn't simply wicked. It was human. It demonstrated to the world that the holiest men could experience desire, that the most devout women could dream, and that beauty could flourish even in the soil of corruption. You kept telling yourself that you'd retire after just one more race. But the circus had a way of whispering, just one more. The younger drivers were faster now, reckless boys who raced as you once had, with no regard for survival. They called you veteranis, half in respect, half in pity. You watched them train and saw your own ghost in their eyes. Hungry, fearless, doomed. The track hadn't changed, but you had. The same sand that had once promised immortality now waited to swallow you whole. Still, the itch always returned each morning. You couldn't ignore the sound of wheels rattling, the thunder of hooves, the intoxicating pull of danger. So you strapped the reins around your waist one last time and stepped into the sunlight. The crowd erupted not just out of routine, but out of recognition. You were a legend now, a living relic from the golden age of the circus. The gates swung open, the horses surged forward, and for a fleeting moment you felt 20 again. The wind tore at your tunic, sand stung your face, and your pulse matched the pounding of the hooves. You hugged the meta tighter than you should have, pride overriding caution. Behind you, a rival's will clipped your axle. You felt the jolt, the violent shudder, the whisper of fate. Then, a heartbeat of silence. Everything seemed to slow down. The sunlight glinted on the marble statues, and the crowd's breath seemed to hiss. It was the moment right before the crash. You didn't pray, you just smiled. You had always known that the circus would be your end. When the wreck finally happened, the crowd roared, not with grief, but in stunned awe. They said the horses ran 3 more laps before they finally stopped, and that the sand beneath them turned crimson. They carried your broken body from the track, draped in the blue colors of your faction, and buried you beneath a small monument just outside the city walls. The inscription read, "He rode with the gods." He fell like a storm. There were no napkins, either. The proper etiquette was to wipe your hands on the nearest dog or neighbor. Monks complained about guests wiping their greasy fingers on religious texts. And yes, there were rules against spitting on the table, which means someone had to invent that rule the hard way. By the 13th century, disgust finally turned into etiquette. Manuals started popping up, like the Book of the Civilized Man, which taught you not to scratch yourself while eating, blow your nose on the tablecloth, or examine your teeth with the knife. These were actual instructions, which means they weren't exactly obvious at the time. The upper class quickly turned hygiene into a status symbol. Peasants could eat with their hands, but nobles used manners to show their superiority, like a social fencing match, but with spoons instead of swords. Eventually, manners became a moral thing. The church decided that proper behavior at the table reflected a clean soul, because nothing says holiness like delicately slurping soup while still believing in witchcraft. By the Renaissance, dining had gone from being about survival to being a performance. Banquets weren't really about eating. They were about proving you weren't a barbarian. It was like Instagram culture, but with trenches instead of plates. And yet, those same medieval rules are still around today. Don't burp. Don't pick your nose. Don't shout. You're not doing them to look polite. You're doing them because, in another timeline, not doing them could have given you dysentery. You probably think the weekend is a modern invention, the result of labor unions, productivity science, or enlightened bosses who value rest. Nope. It was invented by medieval peasants who just wanted to stop working long enough to drink, pray, and maybe even remember what sunlight looked like. In the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as a weekend. You worked until your body broke. Then you worked a little more. Pope Julius II, nicknamed the Warrior Pope, spent more time wearing armor than vestments, leading armies instead of leading prayers. He was known to swear like a soldier and commission art like a king. Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel were, ironically, funded by a pontiff who had fathered at least one illegitimate daughter. Meanwhile, Pope Leo X, from the Medici family, treated the papacy like a Florentine bank account, throwing parties so lavish that even Roman nobles blushed. For these men, indulgences weren't just a church doctrine. They were a lifestyle. Their banquets mixed cardinals, courtesans, poets, and painters, all swimming in gold and gossip. The Vatican treasury was drained not by crusades, but by carnival masks and mistresses. And yet, the faithful kept donating, believing the Pope to be the moral anchor of the world. Rome's streets knew better. When a new pope was elected, the people didn't ask about his holiness. They bet on his lovers. The church had become a theater of sin dressed in silk and incense. Behind every holy decree lay a heartbeat, lustful, ambitious, and entirely human. If the popes were the kings of sin, then the courtesans of Rome were its queens. They weren't the back-alley kind, but the glittering elite, the so-called cortigini onest, or honest courtesans. Honest, of course, in the same way that a wolf is honest about wanting sheep. These women could quote scripture in one breath and recite Ovid in the next, wearing gowns that could bankrupt a cardinal and jewelry that probably already had. One of the most infamous was Imperia Cognati, known simply as La Divina Imperia. Her name alone struck awe and fear in noblemen. She entertained cardinals, artists, and ambassadors in salons perfumed with incense and scandal. She wasn't just a beauty. She was an intellectual, a woman who could dismantle a bishop's argument about virtue while sipping Venetian wine. When she died, the city mourned her as if she were royalty. The Eternal City survived its scandals because, deep down, it never aspired to perfection. It sought immortality. And in that pursuit, even sin became sacred. You weren't born into privilege or fame. You were born into the dust and sweat of the stables. The stables were your crib, the rhythmic sound of hooves your lullaby. In the Roman world, charioteers didn't come from aristocratic families. They came from chains. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or impoverished freedmen with more scars than coins. But that didn't matter, because in the Circus Maximus, even a slave could become a god if he managed to survive long enough to cross the finish line. From the moment you learned to walk, you learned to run alongside the horses. They were your only teachers, demanding, powerful, and unforgiving. The trainers barked orders, cracked whips, and delivered the truth that every boy dreaded to hear. The sand will drink your blood before the crowd ever remembers your name. But you didn't listen. You possessed a hunger that eclipsed your fear. Every morning began before dawn. You shoveled manure, brushed manes, and hauled buckets until your arms trembled. And when the trainers weren't looking, you would sneak into the empty track, feeling the silence of the circus as if it were watching you. You'd imagine the stands filled with thousands of Romans cheering, jeering, wagering everything they owned on your life or death. It wasn't faith that sustained you. It was pride. Pride and the hope that, for a few glorious minutes, all of Rome would see you. The Circus Maximus was the beating heart of the empire, more potent than any temple, louder than any debate in the Senate. 200,000 spectators, their voices echoing through the marble seats. Men screamed, women fainted, and fortunes were made or lost in the time it took to complete 7 laps. No other arena offered such madness or such glory. And somewhere beyond the roar of the circus, you still race, forever chasing the thunder. Long before the pyramids pierced the horizon or temples echoed with hymns to Ra, the real lifeline of Egypt was already hard at work, the Nile. It wasn't just a river. It was an engineer of worlds, carving life out of what would otherwise be desolation. Each year, like clockwork, it rose from the heart of Africa, swelling with the rains of distant lands, spilling its gift across the parched valleys of Egypt. When the waters came, they brought silt, rich, dark, and miraculous. Without it, Egypt would have been nothing more than a kingdom of dust and wind. To the Egyptians, the flood wasn't just a natural event. It was a divine rhythm. They didn't just watch the river, they listened to it. The rise of the water meant rebirth, and its retreat meant the beginning of the harvest. Every life, from the poorest farmer to the most powerful pharaoh, depended on that pulse. The entire calendar revolved around it, marked by 3 sacred seasons: Aket, the flooding; Per, the growing; and Shimu, the harvest. The Nile was time itself, a living clock that set the pace of eternity. But the river was also unpredictable. Some years it rose too high, drowning fields and villages. Other years it failed to flood at all, leaving famine in its wake. So, the Egyptians did what humans always do when faced with the unpredictable whims of nature. They learned to shape it. They measured its depths with nilometers carved into temple stones, recorded its moods, and built a science around its behavior. Over generations, they transformed a wild river into a precision instrument. When the floodwaters began to recede, the people moved quickly, digging canals and reservoirs to trap what remained. Each family took up its part in this yearly ritual, turning mud and water into order. What began as simple survival evolved into mastery. Egypt didn't just live by the Nile, it engineered it. But the church, being somewhat merciful, decided people should occasionally rest, not for their health, of course, but to attend Mass and avoid sinning when unsupervised. The church calendar was packed with feast days, sometimes up to 100 per year. These were religious holidays honoring obscure saints, the Virgin Mary, and sometimes events that sounded suspiciously like excuses for parties. Each feast day meant a day off from work, free food, and the legal right to start drinking before noon. The nobility complained that the peasants had too many holidays. One medieval bishop famously grumbled that the people work 1 day and rest 3. It's probably the first recorded instance of a manager complaining about employee productivity. As the centuries went by, the Reformation cut back, literally canceling dozens of saint days for being too fun. The Puritans, especially, were horrified that people enjoyed resting. So they pushed for a stricter system. One mandatory day of rest, Sunday, which is how the Lord's Day slowly turned into your modern lazy day. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Factory owners noticed that overworked, miserable laborers kept breaking things, including themselves. So they reluctantly brought back rest days. Saturday afternoons were added later, when someone realized that workers who weren't completely exhausted made fewer mistakes, like falling into machinery. By the 20th century, the 2-day weekend had become official. 1 day for God, 1 day for hangovers. So, the next time you collapse into bed on a Saturday night, remember you're enjoying a tradition that was born from medieval religion, refined by Protestant guilt, and perfected by capitalism's need to make you love Mondays again. The weekend wasn't given to humanity out of kindness. It was a holy compromise between sin, survival, and scheduling. And somehow we're still thanking God for it. When you slip on a wedding ring today, you're not just declaring your eternal love. Even the clergy sent flowers, pretending it was out of Christian charity rather than fond memory. At night, you'd lie awake in the stables, gazing at the oil lamps flickering against the walls. Somewhere in the distance, wealthy nobles slept in their opulent villas. But here, amidst the scent of straw and sweat, heroes were forged. You didn't know if you would perish beneath the hooves or triumph above them. You only knew one thing. One day they would chant your name, not as a slave, not as a servant, but as the master of the circus, the charioteer who had tamed the storm. The stables were your whole world, hot, noisy, and perpetually one mistake away from disaster. You served the factions, the racing teams of Rome, each as fierce as a legion in battle. There were the blues and greens, the reds and whites, for colors that divided the empire more deeply than politics or warfare. Every Roman had a favorite, from slaves in the taverns to senators in their togas. The circus wasn't just entertainment, it was a religion, and you were about to become its priest. You started as a stable boy, a mere shadow among giants. You groomed horses until your hands were raw, fed them barley mixed with wine, and learned to discern their moods as skillfully as a soldier reading the enemy. These weren't ordinary animals. They were athletes, warriors in harness. Spanish stallions, Nubian mares, Cappadocian chargers, creatures so valuable that emperors waged wars over them. They were sacred and savage in equal measure. But danger bred discipline. Rival factions routinely sabotaged each other. Buckles were loosened, harnesses were cut, feed was poisoned. A single accident could end a career or a life. You slept lightly, with one hand near your knife and the other resting on the reins. Protecting the horses was protecting your future. The Dominus Viconis, your team master, ruled the stables with an iron fist. He taught you that trust was weakness and hesitation was fatal. He'd slap you on the back and declare, "If the horses don't fear you, boy, the crowd won't respect you." In the shimmer of its waters, civilization found its reflection. The river connected gods to men, priests to peasants, life to death. Its banks became the stage where humanity learned that control over nature wasn't about domination, but about harmony. The Nile didn't belong to Egypt. Egypt belonged to the Nile, and it would keep shaping her destiny for thousands of years. When the Nile rose, Egypt held its breath. The flood was both miracle and menace, a blessing that could easily turn to ruin. For centuries, survival meant predicting the river's moods. And so, the Egyptians became mathematicians, astronomers, and engineers long before those words even existed. They measured the world not by stars or empires, but by water. The priests of Heliopolis watched the sky, marking the annual rising of the star Sirius, Sothis, which heralded the coming flood. Its appearance in the dawn sky wasn't mere superstition. It was a signal from the heavens that the Nile was on its way. Villagers would cheer when they saw it because it meant life had been renewed. But predicting the flood was only half the battle. Controlling it was the real test. Along the riverbanks, workers dug canals that stretched for miles, guiding the waters into basins and channels. With wooden shovels and stone picks, they carved Egypt's first arteries of irrigation. The engineers divided the land into fields bordered by low earthen walls that trapped the floodwater and let it soak slowly into the soil. When the waters withdrew, they left behind perfect moisture for planting barley, flax, and wheat. This wasn't chaos. It was geometry. The fields were measured with precision, each plot mapped and taxed according to its fertility. Surveyors, called rope stretchers, walked the land after every flood to redraw boundaries washed away by the current. Their ropes weren't just tools. They were the birth of mathematics itself. But nature never fully obeyed. When the river failed to rise, drought devoured everything. You're reenacting a medieval property exchange. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about romance. It was an economic transaction with some fancy vows thrown in. Love came after the paperwork, usually followed by regret and joint land management. The ring wasn't a symbol of devotion. It was a receipt. The origin of the ring goes way back to ancient Egypt, where circular bands symbolized eternity. The idea traveled through Rome, where men gave rings to women as proof of ownership. By the time it reached medieval Europe, the church realized this was great PR, a symbol of faithfulness that also worked as a legal shackle. The ring was put on the fourth finger of the left hand because people thought there was a vein of love, the vena amoris, that ran straight to the heart. This was complete nonsense. Medieval science also thought headaches came from demons and that leeches had medical degrees. But the myth stuck around, mostly because it sounded romantic enough to justify the expense of gold. Weddings themselves were barely religious until the church got involved. Before that, it was just common law. You said, "I do," in front of some witnesses, shook hands, and boom, legally married. The church saw a business opportunity. Soon, only unions blessed by a clergyman were valid, and rings became mandatory props. And don't be fooled. Those early rings were rarely worn by men. For centuries, the ring was a one-way symbol, a woman's visible sign of possession, not partnership. Husbands didn't start wearing them until the 20th century, when World War II soldiers started sporting rings to remember their wives, or to let everyone know they were taken, even overseas. Now, the wedding ring is everywhere. A tiny halo of metal that supposedly represents love, trust, and eternity, until someone leaves it on the bathroom sink. So, when you glance at that band of gold, remember what it really means. Not eternal romance, not divine blessing. And yet, you couldn't rule by fear alone. You had to earn the horse's loyalty, their heartbeats synchronizing with yours as the chariot thundered forward. That bond was your only armor. At night, the stables resonated with hushed prayers. Drivers traced protective symbols on the horses' foreheads, invoking Neptune, god of horses and the sea. Others offered wine to Fortuna, the goddess of luck, because skill alone wasn't enough. One broken axle, one loose strap, one moment of hesitation, and your body would be trampled into the sand before the crowd even gasped. Still, you remained. You endured the heat, the sweat, and the constant peril, because every lap around the circus held the promise of something more intoxicating than freedom, immortality. And you were prepared to toil in those stables until the gods took notice of your burning ambition. Your first time behind the reins wasn't a race. It was a battle against sheer terror. The chariot was lighter than it looked, a fragile framework of wood and leather balanced on razor-thin wheels. One wrong move, one misstep from the horses, and you'd be dragged to your death before anyone could utter your name. The trainers called it learning, you called it surviving. Every sunrise meant more drills. You learned to maintain your balance as the chariot bounced over the uneven ground. The reins were wrapped not in your hands, but around your waist, allowing you to steer with your whole body. But if you fell, you'd be dragged until you were nothing but a smear on the track. It was the first and most brutal lesson. Mastery and death were intertwined. When it flooded too high, entire villages vanished under the surge. To tame it, the Egyptians built dikes and embankments, sometimes even small dams of stone and mud. These works required not just muscle but unity, a society that could move tens of thousands of men with a single command. The Nile wasn't merely a source of food. It was a proving ground for organization, labor, and genius. It demanded constant vigilance and rewarded discipline. Over generations, Egypt learned the art of cooperation through water. And as the river obeyed, it taught its people something timeless. That civilization isn't built by conquest, but by rhythm, by mastering the flood without defying it. To the ancient Egyptians, time itself flowed from the Nile. The river's pulse shaped the calendar, the rituals, even the emotions of an entire civilization. While other cultures marked the years by the movement of kings or the whims of war, Egypt measured existence by the rise and fall of the water. Every year was a cycle of death, rebirth, and harvest, played out not in temples or palaces, but in the river's current. The Egyptians divided their year into 3 great seasons. Ake, the inundation, when the floods swallowed the fields. Parait, the growing season, when crops sprouted from the black silt. And Shimu, the harvest, when the earth gave back what the Nile had promised. Each season lasted 4 months, each month 30 days, plus a handful of festival days added to please the gods and balance the cosmic order. The rhythm was mathematical, but its meaning was spiritual. When the star Sothis, Sirius, rose in the eastern sky just before dawn, it signaled the start of Ake. Priests at temples along the river watched for it with sacred precision. They believed this shining herald was the goddess of the flood herself, her light awakening the sleeping Nile. It was the Egyptians' first astronomical prediction, a cosmic calendar that united heaven, earth, and water. It's a medieval merger agreement that survived every cultural collapse since the Crusades. You're not wearing a symbol of love. You're wearing a 900-year-old contract with better marketing. In the Middle Ages, the average person's home made a modern studio apartment look like Versailles. Walls were optional, doors were overrated, and privacy was a myth. Most people lived in one-room houses shared with their family, animals, and whatever ghosts were hanging out in the rafters. The medieval idea of personal space was, please stop stepping on the chicken. But then came fabric, that amazing technology that could hide things without building new walls. Curtains started out as practical objects, heavy drapes to keep out drafts, flies, and nosy neighbors. But soon they became social statements. Nobles started hanging thick, embroidered curtains around their beds, not just for warmth, but for status. These bed hangings were like portable bedrooms, creating the illusion of privacy in a hall full of servants, snoring relatives, and the occasional bard. If you were rich enough, your bed had curtains so elaborate they could double as stage sets. Some even had inner curtains for privacy from their own spouse. Apparently, guests slept in the same room, sometimes even the same bed. So if you wanted to change clothes, pray, or have a dramatic cry, curtains were your only defense. Every village had its rituals to welcome the flood. Farmers sang to Hapi, the god of the Nile, offering bread and beer to ensure the waters rose just enough. Not too little to starve them, not too high to drown their homes. The flood's arrival wasn't just anticipated. It was celebrated like the return of a god. The flood calendar gave the Egyptians something no other early civilization possessed: predictability. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to store grain. The Nile turned chaos into order, nature into schedule, survival into tradition. Time, once wild and unknowable, now ticked with the certainty of a clock made of water. In the world beyond Egypt, seasons meant fear. But here, the people of the Nile faced the future with calm. They didn't resist the river's rhythm. They lived by it. In its steady heartbeat, they found eternity, measured not in years or rains, but in floods. The Egyptians didn't just wait for the Nile. They shaped it. Every canal, basin, and reservoir was a thread in the grand tapestry of an engineered landscape. The early pharaohs understood that whoever controlled the water controlled the kingdom. Power flowed through ditches and dikes as surely as it did through thrones and crowns.